at that time. But I have no doubt that the wise counsel of some of your founder members was sought. And judging by the outcome, it was clearly good advice. Today, the insights of your experts are just as important as we seek to navigate a rapidly changing world, as we seek to adapt and harness change, and work together to seize the opportunities which change brings. We need that type of dynamic, creative thinking, because I know that many people in this city are nervous about the rapidly changing politics, the rise of new powers, and the moving tectonic plates of global politics. People still worry about Brexit and what role Britain will play in the world. No one should worry. For while Britain is leaving the European Union, we are clear about our role and place in the world. We will remain a nation that champions those fundamental values of freedom, democracy, and tolerance. We will remain a global trading nation, and we will remain a global force for good, always committed to strengthening our international security and prosperity. And Brexit is Britain's moment. Britain's moment to look up, be more ambitious, redefine our place in the world. In some ways, the European Union has limited our vision, discouraged us from looking to the horizon. Now we are being free to reach further and aim higher. The UK is determined to seize these new opportunities. My job as Defence Secretary is to make sure that we can develop and, if necessary, deploy hard power, which underpins the soft power of our global influence. We start from the strongest of foundations. Britain is a major global actor. We have always been a Tier 1 military power, and we always will be a Tier 1 military power, possessing an independent nuclear deterrent, world-class special forces and cyber capabilities, exceptional conventional forces able to deploy independently around the globe, and take command of coalition forces to deliver joint outcomes. But we also agree with the United States National Defence Strategy that by working together with allies and partners, we amass the greatest possible strength for the long-term advancement of our interests. After all, we need international solutions to international problems. In the past few years, we've seen global terror hit our streets on both sides of the Atlantic. At the same time, we've witnessed increased competition between states, a terror sponsoring Iran, a nuclear-armed North Korea, not forgetting to mention a rising China, an increasingly aggressive Russia, using every weapon at its disposal to advance its interests. A Russia whose use of covert operations and cyber warfare, political subversion, and increased military posturing is part of a wider pattern of malign behaviour. Who would have thought a year ago that we would have seen in the United Kingdom, in a sleepy cathedral town in the middle of the English countryside, the use of chemical weapons, the first use of chemical weapons in Europe since the Second World War. It demonstrates the fact that the dangers are diversifying, with states adopting the tactics of terrorists and terrorists increasingly armed with more and more sophisticated weapons, including cyber capabilities, all blurring the line between peace and conflict. It's clear we're in a new age of intertwined dangers, and it is getting ever more complex. So it is even more important that we stand together with our allies. Now, I'm not here to give you a history lesson, but some of you may be aware that in the 1770s we were having a little bit of local difficulty in this area. In 1778, the last British governor of New York wrote to George Washington. It was the moment that we were about to vacate the city, and he wrote, "The recent hostilities have been regrettable, but as we withdraw, we do so in the hope that our two nations will build on a common heritage and act together to the betterment of the world." Well, all those years ago, those words are so very, very true. We have no stronger ally than the United States, and there's a reason so many have called our relationship special. For more than 100 years, our armed forces have fought in defence of our common values and interests. From the turmoil of the Great War, through the dark days of World War II, from the heat of Korea to the chill of the Cold War, from the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq today, we have developed the deepest, broadest, and most advanced defence relationship of any two nations. The United States has never had nor will have a more reliable ally than Great Britain. Others may pretend, but you will find no greater ally than us. And to those who prefer to dismiss what the UK can do, I have one message. We stand with you ready, willing, and able to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Our appetite, our desire, our will to be a force for change, a force for good, a force of light that stands as a beacon to the world, that burns more brightly today than it has in the last 70 years. That is what Great Britain is. Let me explain what I mean in more detail. First, we are ready to respond to any situation at a moment's notice. We have forward deployed forces across the globe. We can draw on our overseas territories in Gibraltar, the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, Ascension Islands, the Falkland Islands, the British Indian Ocean territories. These often provide key facilities not just for us, but also for the United States. And we're extending our presence with our new naval base in Bahrain. We can also bring in allies other than the US as and when required, such as our 9-nation joint expeditionary force of like-minded Northern European nations, which can muster up to 10,000 personnel to respond to any type of operation. From humanitarian assistance through to high-end warfighting. Above all, our readiness comes from having world-class personnel, the embodiment of our global Britain, our Great Britain. More than 14,000 personnel deployed on operations around the globe, with 19,000 preparing to deploy or at readiness to respond. Currently, they're in the North Atlantic, commanding and directing anti-submarine warfare operations, keeping an eye on the undersea cables that underpin our online systems. They're on the eastern fringes of Europe too, supporting NATO's deterrence against the resurgent Russia, policing the Black Sea, the Baltic and soon Icelandic skies, and leading NATO's presence in Estonia. In March, I visited our troops close to the Estonian border with Russia. I was struck, but not surprised, by how many locals still saw Britain as a liberator and protector, willing to stand up for their freedom as we have so often done in the past. Our people are not just in Estonia, they're in Poland too, proudly operating side by side with the US battle group. It underlines the ever-increasing integration of our forces, who serve and train together regularly, so they can fight together seamlessly. You see this integration between our armies, from battle group through brigade, division to corps. You see it between our air forces and our navies. And you see it between your US Marines, who will have the privilege of seeing in action at their famous sunset parade later today. And of course, as was mentioned, our Royal Marine Commandos. In recent months, both the US Marines and our Royal Marines have been exercising alongside one another in the Baltic, in Guam, developing new ways of operating in an information age. And they'll be working together as part of the Marine Expeditionary Force headquarters on Exercise Trident Juncture in Norway later on this year. Being ready is only one thing, but the United Kingdom has that essential willingness, a willingness to act. The willingness to use military force when other measures fail. The willingness to operate where others cannot or will not go. Look at the way UK pilots joined their US counterparts to strike Assad's chemical facilities after the appalling chemical attacks in Douma. Or look at our operations targeting ISIL in Iraq and Syria, conducting more than 1,700 strikes against terrorist targets, training more than 77,000 Iraqi security forces in infantry skills, counter-IED, engineering and medical expertise, and providing the second most significant contribution to the military campaign after the United States. But the UK is not just in the Middle East. We're in Afghanistan, training a new generation of officers to secure their fledgling democracy. And by committing a second battalion to go to Kabul, we're demonstrating a continued commitment to Afghanistan and the Afghan people. We're also in the Indo-Pacific, where we led the way by deploying Royal Naval ships to be the first nation to enforce United Nations sanctions against North Korea, and where we're maintaining an unbroken presence of Royal Navy surface competence throughout this year and next, increasing our presence around the globe. And when it comes to China, we have our eyes wide open. We have a positive relationship with Beijing and wish to build on that. But we will not shrink from telling them when we feel that they do not respect the commonly accepted rules and norms of international behaviour, the laws and systems by which we all, China included, benefit and have a duty to protect. In this respect, their militarization of artificial features in the South China Sea is a backward step and puts them on the wrong side of the line of what people expect from great international nations. If you wish to be respected as a global power, you have to respect the international norms and behaviours that bind the international community together. And from the continent of Asia to Africa, I've just returned from Mogadishu in Somalia, and also having had the opportunity to visit Ethiopia and Kenya, where I've seen firsthand the excellent work of UK forces, training, stopping terrorists and helping bring stability. In Mali, We're providing our French allies with strategic lift and Chinooks. And let's be clear, we are the only power in Europe with the capacity and the capability to do that. And in South Sudan, our people have built a United Nations hospital, bringing vital aid in the midst of an awful humanitarian crisis. Whether the danger is near or far, whether we're acting unilaterally, bilaterally or multilaterally, the UK continues stepping up. I've already touched on our NATO efforts, but since I'm at the Atlantic Council, I hope you'll permit me to say a few more words in support of the alliance. For it's worth remembering that European nations are not its sole beneficiary. The only time that Article 5 has ever been invoked was after 9/11, when Great Britain and other NATO nations stood side by side with you after the atrocities that we saw. Just as the United Kingdom helps the United States shoulder the burden of international security, so does NATO. It is providing a majority of forces for the alliance's new Iraq mission. European allies lead NATO's 40,000-strong response force. They're responsible for 85% of the Kosovo mission in the Balkans. And at the most recent summit, allies agreed a readiness initiative within the next 18 months to have 30 mechanised battalions, 30 combat vessels, and 30 air squadrons ready to use in 30 days. Alongside the US, the UK has been pressing for the alliance to do more, to pay its way. We're now seeing the results. Last year saw NATO's biggest spending increase in 25 years. Since making the Defence Investment Pledge at the 2014 Wales Summit, allies have spent $87 billion more on defence. In just 2 years' time, that number will increase to at least $150 billion. 4 years ago, only 3 allies spent 2% of their GDP on defence. By the end of this year, 8 will meet that target. And increasingly, we're seeing more partners pull their weight, realising that they've got to spend more because of the increasing threats that the world faces. They're investing in capabilities essential and relevant to modern warfare, making sure that they have the best equipment and the very best technology. So the UK is ready, we're willing, but what makes us reliable partners for the long term is the fact that we are able to act now and far in the future. Thanks to our world-class defence, technology and industrial base. Some mistakenly believe that only America can develop cutting-edge technologies or capabilities. That has never been and never will be the case. The UK has always brought something special to the table. From the perilous days of the Second World War, when an unassuming British scientist named Henry Tizard flew to the United States, taking with him a black box containing the secrets of airborne radar and the turbojet. And from then, right up until today, the UK is the biggest offshore supplier to the US military, with the skills to meet a host of your requirements, from avionics and vehicle communications to military bridging and CBRN. That's why 60 years on from the signing of the Mutual Defence Agreement, we continue to cooperate on nuclear technology. There can surely be no greater sign of trust than our willingness to work together on a common missile compartment for our Dreadnought submarines and your US Columbia-class submarines. And that's why the UK is a Tier 1 partner on F-35, one of the biggest equipment programmes of them all, with the UK producing 15% of every aircraft built, bringing unique British-made capabilities into this development of this stealth fighter. With the arrival of our new 65,000-ton aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, to the East Coast, we take another step towards that momentous day in 2021, when the US Marine Corps embark a squadron of F-35Bs alongside our own, and for the first time, we watch a fifth-generation aircraft fly from the world's first fifth-generation carrier. In other words, a vibrant UK defence industry spurring healthy competition. This is very much in our shared interests. Why reinvent the wheel when you can buy from a trusted partner? It's a two-way street. You invest in us and we invest in you. Today we're procuring more than 50 types of defence equipment from the United States, including P-8 maritime patrol aircraft to Apache attack helicopters to Reaper drones. All the while, UK industry is creating US jobs. UK defence companies employ more than 56,000 staff in the United States, with UK businesses employing more than 1 million US employees. We're helping fund programs collectively supporting the livelihoods of 160,000 Americans. Unsurprisingly, the UK is one of only a handful of trusted partners to be included within the National Technology Industrial Base Initiative, which is looking at sharing ideas, achieving better value for money, and making global supply chains more resilient so we can sustain our military advantage in the future. We must take maximum advantage of this to create the jobs for prosperity that both the UK and the US needs. But the UK also combines world-class capability with strategic long-term ambition. This year, our world-famous Royal Air Force celebrates its 100th birthday. Far from dwelling on the glory years of the Spitfire fighter or the Lancaster bomber, we've unveiled a new combat air strategy to build the next generation of Tempest fighters. No wonder today our great nations together continue pushing the boundaries of innovation, working on insect-like UAVs, on robots that can brave the last mile of the battlefield, on offensive cyber tools to deter, disrupt and constrain malicious activity. In May, it was my privilege to host a meeting between US and UK innovation experts, designed to strengthen our cooperation still further. We're now running a UK-US funded competition seeking innovative technologies to destroy chemical and biological munitions, IEDs and bulk agents in challenging environments. And we're investigating new ways to transform the famously convoluted acquisition process, leaping the valley of death between research and procurement, rapidly developing novel technologies and state-of-the-art software, and developing a cutting-edge chemical weapons defence centre. So the United Kingdom is ready, willing, and able to act when necessary. And our modernising defence programme will make sure you can continue to rely on us far into the future. It sets out our vision for dealing with the complex challenges of the 21st century. It will give us a lethal fighting force, matching the pace at which our adversaries can now move in every domain from nuclear and conventional to hybrid threats, while strengthening our resilience in an information age to achieve what we're calling information advantage. It will make sure international cooperation is built into our DNA, deepening our relationships across the globe and seeing how we can further rebalance our global posture to be ready and willing to fight in mainland Europe, in the Middle East or in the Far East. And our programme will transform our defence business speeding up our processes and bridging the gap between the emergence and adoption of new technologies. The next phase is all about delivery. But we will continue seeking the views of our close Pentagon colleagues and the brilliant minds in this room to shape and refine our plans. So we may be entering a more unpredictable and uncertain age. But I'm profoundly optimistic about our future. The United Kingdom remains a great power, a country with one of the world's biggest economies, a creative powerhouse, a force for good. And we continue having one of the most credible armed forces anywhere on the planet. A force that will continue using its power, hard and soft, in concert with our greatest ally, the United States. We will always be the most natural of partners together. 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan gave a great speech to the annual meeting of the Atlantic Council. He spoke of his hopes of a rapprochement between East and West. He spoke of being for freedom and democracy without hesitation or apology. And he quotes the words of that great Anglo-American Winston Churchill: "Where we are able to stand together and work together for righteous causes, we shall always be thankful, and the world will always be free." So let us seize this moment to strengthen our transatlantic ties. In the face of an ever greater unpredictability, let us show our certainty in being ready, willing and able to act as that great bastion of international peace and prosperity. And let us do everything in our power to make sure those great Anglo-American values prevail, those values of liberty, justice and democracy that underpin the Magna Carta and your Constitution. They represent more than just the souls of our nations, but they are the cornerstone of the Western world. But please, never, never underestimate my nation. As we have changed the world time and time and time again, and we will change the world in the future. For we as a nation, when we realize that it is in our interests, or when it is right, we as a nation always act. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Secretary, for that very comprehensive address. You've given us a lot of food for thought, many topics to explore. We appreciate your being with us at the Atlantic Council here today. So if I may, I'd like to follow up on some of those topics, and then we'll open it up because I know our audience is also most anxious to have the conversation with you. So let's begin with a little bit more about the NATO summit. And as General Jones said, there really were quite a few important deliverables out of that summit, although it somewhat got lost in the headlines. So for example, there were developments designed to focus on alliance readiness, creating a new cyber command, mobility, a command structure reform. There were many good developments. And my question is, how will the UK play a leadership role in some of these initiatives going forward? What will your role be?
So if we take cyber as a good example, we're the only nation that's so far dedicated our cyber attack capabilities to NATO. We're encouraging other nations to do the same. But we also play an important role in terms of being the glue of NATO, of actually, obviously the United States will always bring the enormous size and enormous amount of resource to it, but actually encouraging and bringing other nations into participating, into operations, into exercises, reinforcing the message that every nation, no matter what their size, where they are within NATO, plays an important role. And that's not just in terms of the defence of the continent, but actually in terms of other NATO operations. And you see a lot of benefit of that, whether it is in Iraq, the increasing role that NATO plays, and the fact that actually we often act as one of those nations that encourages other nations to take part, but also in Afghanistan, where there's so many NATO partners, so many NATO nations that are going to Afghanistan, understanding the importance that Afghanistan plays, not just to the region, but actually to the whole world. And we can play a vital role in doing that, but also leading by example, investing in our military, making sure that we have the best capabilities, not just in terms of mass of numbers, but actually, just as importantly, the right technology and the right equipment in order to be able to fight.
That is actually a great segue to the second topic I wanted
This wasn't planned.
Yes. Good straight man, as we say here in the United States. I wanted to ask you about your Modernizing Defense program, which of course has strategy elements. There are budget implications, but this is essentially your roadmap for the future of how you would invest against the various threats that we collectively face. And so my question to you is, understanding that it is not fully completed, could you give us an update on where it stands? How are the budget discussions going? And I would note that there was a recent UK House of Commons defense report that indicated that 2% is fantastic, and you've been there for years, but 3% would be a lot better for the threats that you're facing. Could you comment on that as well?
So in terms of cash, I sort of take a quite conservative view in terms of cash. I don't think you should start off really always just with percentages. What you should look at, what are the threats? What do you need to deal with those threats? What type of capabilities a nation needs to have, and then we need to invest in them, and the price comes out at the end of it. And that's what we're doing in terms of a modernising defence programme, looking at the threats that we face. When we did a similar review in 2010, we said we didn't believe there were any state-based threats. In 2015, when we looked around the world, we said that we thought Russia was an emerging threat, but we weren't 100% certain as to which way it would break. I think that the experiences that the world has seen since 2015 is quite clearly a threat to not just Great Britain, not just continental Europe, to many nations around the world. So what we're doing is taking the opportunity to think, what are those capabilities to deal with those threats, and what is the price for doing that? And that's what we hope to come up with. But it's also thinking about how we do our armed forces better. Traditionally, when we've looked at programs, we've seen programs that have lasted from an inception to the delivery of a product, sometimes not just 4 or 5 years, not just 10, 12 years, but sometimes 15 or 20 years. That isn't going to be acceptable in this ever-changing world where technology moves so quickly. We've got to be able to have a technology that, and the innovation in order to be able to adapt. And that is, of course, having the most high-tech platforms, but the ability to change those high-tech platforms. Because what is the most high-tech this year, by next year is not going to be the most high-tech. So creating the open architecture to be able to upgrade, constantly innovate on the equipment that we have, but not losing sight that there is a certain quality to mass, and we shouldn't always be going for purely the most exquisite. We need to have the ability to be able to field numbers. We've got to be able to have presence around the globe, and we've got to be in a position where we don't just constantly sort of get things that are ever more expensive, but a smaller and smaller number of them. So that's the sort of broad push. But the world is getting so much more unpredictable, and if Britain cannot play a role, if Britain doesn't have the ability and the means to project our will and to be able to influence decisions and events, then that's something that I think the British people and British politicians are not comfortable with. And we recognise soft power is so important. The work we do through diplomacy, the work we do through development aid, cultural influences, all vital. But behind that, there always has to sit hard power, and it's making sure we get that hard power right, effective and deployable. And we have always proven to be a nation that's been willing to deploy and willing to fight.
Would you say we could expect to know more about the modernization program in the fall? And would you have any sneak previews for us about areas of investment that might get particular notice?
So in the first part of the question, before the end of this year, and second part of the question, I'm afraid no.
Afraid no. I kind of figured, but I figured I'd try.
Yeah, well, God loves a trier.
Yes. You mentioned Brexit. Obviously, we're watching that very closely here on this side of the Atlantic, and you talked about how the alliance would remain firm no matter what happens on Brexit. But I'm wondering about defense spending particularly, and there's been speculation that with Brexit there could come increased pressures in a negative way for defense spending. Is that a worry to you? Are you feeling that within your discussions within Parliament?
Well, let's be totally clear. Britain leaving the European Union has no impact in terms of the security and defence of Europe. Britain has been involved in the defence and security of Europe, not just for the last 30, 40 years, not just since the Second World War, but literally for centuries, since Henry VIII's involvement and many other kings and queens, both before and since. And Britain will be integral to the defence of continental Europe. Our interests are for a secure and stable continent. Our interests are to make sure that security in Europe is absolutely guaranteed. And the greatest guarantor of that security is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is what has brought stability and security to continental Europe over the last 69 years, more than any other organization.
Let me now swing to the Middle East, which of course you spoke of Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq. Obviously, I think in Syria, the war, I'll say, against ISIL is wrapping up, but there's major questions remaining about the future of Syria. I think most people would say Iraq has evolved in a positive way, and then there is Afghanistan, which I think many people have questions about. Where are we going, and how will it all work out? You have recently put more troops into Afghanistan. You've been a key partner throughout it all. Would you just share your thoughts about where are we collectively going, our joint interests in these three countries? So
if we take Iraq and Syria, and you're right to say that great progress has been made in Iraq, and I remember at the time of the intervention first in Iraq, most people said that it was going to be impossible to actually make a difference, to push back ISIL literally from the gates of Baghdad. But that is what has been achieved, led by the United States with local partners, but also with international allies such as the United Kingdom and France. And we have been able to push ISIL back, reduce their territory, degrade them, and what they're able to do. And we should be immensely proud of that. But we've also got to be realistic, because while the threat has been reduced, it still remains there and it's dispersing. And the idea that there will be one moment where ISIL and its poisonous ideology is dead forever, that's sadly not something that I think anyone will truly be able to achieve. But what it does mean to say that nations such as Britain and the United States have constantly got to be engaged in terms of that fight, making sure that they don't get such a foothold that they were able to get in Iraq and Syria. And that fight will continue, and it might be in different realms and it might be in different areas, but we've got to continue doing that. But in terms of Afghanistan, I think we are at a moment where there is an opportunity to reach out where there could be a longer lasting peace. And we have consistently seen different actors play a role in Afghanistan, whether that is Pakistan, whether that is Iran, or whether that is Russia. It has incredibly porous borders, and as a very wise person once told me, unless you can seal the borders, it's very difficult to be able to deal with an insurgency. But we've got to commit to doing more, to give Afghanistan this moment where there's an opportunity of some reconciliation, the opportunity of a political process to start moving forward. I think we are duty bound as nations to support the Afghan government, to give them that chance to make that hope a reality. And it'll be interesting. The next few years will determine as to whether that is going to be the case. But the prize will be incredibly great if that's something that we can achieve.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary. What I'd like to do now is invite our audience to participate in the conversation. So we do have roving microphones. So please wait until the microphone comes to you when I call upon you. And also please be quite succinct with your questions. Yes, sir, right here, second row.
Thank you. Tom Watkins, Agence France Presse. The thrust of your speech, sir, seemed to be aimed at convincing your US counterparts that Britain is still a partner to rely on, given the difficulties of the Brexit negotiations. My question, sir, is how much can Britain rely on America, especially given President Trump's disdain for international partnerships and his withdrawal from the Iran deal? Thank you.
What you see is a United States that is incredibly committed to NATO, that has deployed and put more resources into the defence of NATO over the last 2-3 years than we've seen over the last 20 years. And I say you judge a nation on their actions, and that is what the United States has been doing. And the US has been the most reliable partners for us and many other nations, and I have no doubt that that will continue, and that will continue to grow. And defence is a brilliant example of the depth of that relationship. So many British service personnel working side by side together, making sure that the world is a much more peaceful place, and you're seeing that level of commitment not degraded but actually stepped up over the last few years.
Okay. Saw a hand go up here, the gentleman about midway back.
I'm Shad Qureshi. I'm a Defense and Foreign Policy intern at Cato. I had a two-part question. One to follow up on that one. How does the UK plan on balancing, in regards to the Iran deal, its obligations to the deal itself versus the sanctions that were re-implemented yesterday? And my second question is, does the UK have any concerns in its defense relationship with Saudi Arabia in the context of the situation in Yemen?
Okay, so firstly on the Iran deal, I mean, we really encourage the United States, along with all nations, to get round the table and start discussing about actually how we have something that can work. The JCPOA was a deal that we felt was the best possible deal that was achievable. None of us ever pretended it was a perfect deal, but actually it did deliver a number of important measures that I think everyone benefits from. So we really just encourage the United States to start talking to its partners in Iran in order to be able to find a route forward. In terms of Saudi have been a very long-standing and traditional ally of the United Kingdom, and they will remain a very long-standing ally of ours going forward. The amount of work that we do, whether dealing with counter-terrorism, when we're dealing with instability in terms of strength as an industrial partner and as an ally, is something that we value greatly, and we see that going forward for many years hence.
Let's see, I saw this gentleman's hand first, right over here.
Thank you. I'm Steve Winters, independent consultant. General Jones mentioned strategy as one of your areas, and you briefly alluded to the U.S. national security strategy. So my question is, what is your view of the role of grand strategy as opposed to, I mean, it appears that China has announced a grand strategy, and is there still a role for grand strategy coming from the West or NATO?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and it's a very challenging question, because I think that the debates about grand strategy among NATO partners, among the West, among our friends and allies, there's not enough talk about it. Where is the world going to be, not just in 10 years' time, but actually in the next 50 years' time, when my daughters are becoming old ladies. You know, you want to be having that conversation, because if we do not have that conversation, if we do not start planning for it, we will be unprepared for it. And the one thing that you do see with a nation such as China, they do have that grand strategy, they have that plan for the future, and we have to deliver that as well. And we have to be thinking about actually how we make sure that China plays an important, valuable and positive role on the world stage. That's something that I believe that they want to do. They want to see themselves and playing that role. And part of our grand strategy will be to encourage them and deliver them into that positive world role. But yes, all Western governments need to spend a lot longer. And it was something that a former Foreign Secretary once said to me. They said, well, so often they would go to these summits and they'd talk about what was happening today, what was happening next week, what was happening in the here and now. And it was sometimes only in the evening over dinner that they would start to talk about what the world will look like and how you adapt. Whereas actually really the value would be actually spending a day, 2 days, a week discussing it and starting to come up with those ideas and working on that. And I think that is a weakness of the West, and we have to deal with it, and we have to deal with it soon and quickly.
The lady in the third row here.
Elaine Sereo, Associate Rector of UAC UWIUU in Kiev, Ukraine. Thank you, sir, very much for your important address to us today. I'd like to ask you, how regarding the UK's understanding of Russia's both physical, chemical, and cyber attacks that have gone on throughout the world, the chemical being in England, as you stated. How do you see the UK now role as a leading member of NATO address this, possibly within Ukraine, to counter Russia's aggression? Thank you.
The best way of avoiding any type of conflict is deterrence, and making sure that NATO has the right level of deterrence across its borders, to make sure that Russia understands that you know, it cannot get away with impunity if it acts in an inappropriate or improper way, such as it did in Salisbury. In terms of Ukraine, it's very important that we send those consistent messages to the Ukrainian people in terms of our support, in terms of our help, and in terms of the assistance that we have, not just Britain but many other nations have been given the Ukrainians, and making it clear to Russia that they need to be part of a solution to Ukraine, encouraging the withdrawal of Russian forces from Crimea and the ending of the effective, you know, the troubles and the violence in the Donbass. Russia has to understand through the regime that we put in place in terms of sanctions that there is a consequence to the actions that they have undertaken in the Ukraine.
Vago.
Hi, sir. How are you? Sir, how are you? Good to see you, Madam Secretary. Sir, Vago Muradian from Defense and Aerospace Report. I have a two-part question. Earlier, the United Kingdom has invested in frontline capability. For example, 2 big-deck aircraft carriers, cutting-edge combat aircraft. The numbers are still in debate, so I think that a former Air Force Secretary would like to know what some of those acquisition numbers are going to be. The concern is that these forces are so small and units are so expensive, they will be too dear to risk and lose. That's a question, for example, for the aircraft carrier. Historically, great powers have been willing to expend resources, but now the debate and the concern is that the systems themselves are so expensive, they'll be hard to risk. Second question is on Type 31. Would the United Kingdom be willing to risk Queen Elizabeth or Prince of Wales in a major power conflict, another Falkland scenario where 20% of the fleet was lost in order to achieve the mission, or lost or damaged? In the case of Type 31, what does Type 31 look like now that there is a pause? Thank you.
So in terms of exquisite technology, you make a very valid point, and it's a matter that I touched on briefly about the fact that you need to have that blend of both the top end, the most capable, the most exquisite of technologies, but also utility as well. And that's what we're trying to achieve, because we do need to have mass in terms of our armed forces. We do need to have mass in terms of both the land, sea and air realms. And you raise an interesting point about the Falklands. People doubted that Britain would act in order to regain our sovereignty and of the Falklands, and we did act, and we would act again. There is never going to be a moment that we allow another country to invade our territory and take it from us. And we lost a lot of ships, and at the time there was a class of ship called the 22. It was a very capable ship, it was a utility ship, and we lost a number of Type 22s as part of that conflict, but actually many came back, and a lot of them continued to serve until quite recently and played an important and vital role in the Royal Navy. That's why we're introducing the Type 31. We're proceeding with it. There's been a slight pause, but it's going to be underway. We need those Type 31s because we realise and understand we need to have the mass that is required in our Royal Navy in order to be able to have those points of presence right across the globe. Because, as I say, let's not underestimate what we can and what we do achieve with our Royal Navy. Our Navy was the first one to enforce sanctions against North Korea. We were the first Navy to start interdicting ships. We continuously, right around the globe, continue to have that presence of the top end, top quality type of technology, such as the Type 45 destroyers, the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, to be joined by HMS Prince of Wales that will be soon finished. We need those capabilities, but we do also recognise we need the mass, and we recognise that actually our fleet, our armed forces are there to act in order to protect our national interests, but also to protect our global values as well.
One more question, and then we will do a quick wrap up. We'll give the final say to the Secretary. Yes, the lady right there in the fourth row.
Hi, Yasmin Tajde, National Defense Magazine. To what extent does the UK plan to work with US aerospace firms as it pursues Tempest?
Well, very closely, but we have a great tradition of producing the best fighters in the world. We have a great tradition of having that national sovereign capability, and we are never going to be wanting to surrender that. But in terms of actually working with international partners, we're very open to it. We're very open to other companies coming in and being part of what is initially a coalition between 4 companies and the Ministry of Defence, which is BAE Systems, it's Leonardo, an Italian business, MBDA, a weapons business that is Anglo-French, and Rolls-Royce as well. And we're very open to, as we develop the idea, as we develop the concept, for other nations and other businesses becoming part of that consortium. But we recognise the need for us to have the ability to deliver our own fighter aircraft in the future, and we're very confident we can produce the world's best fighter aircraft, and something that I very much hope the US Air Force will be looking to buy in the future. You do tend to be a tad protectionist on these matters, though.
Mr. Secretary, this has been a terribly insightful conversation. Again, we're very appreciative of your spending the time with us. Let me offer you any final words.
Well, people, there's always probably a great value put to the word special relationship in the United Kingdom, and I hope there is a value put in the United States to that special relationship. But before I had the privilege of doing this job, I don't think I truly understood the depth of relationship of what we do every single day between our armed forces. I don't think anyone can truly comprehend the closeness, the cooperation, the working together, the friendships and the relationships that are built up. And there can be probably no greater way than actually create. That is something that is incredibly special, something that is incredibly unique, and something that creates such a deep bond. And that precious relationship is something that, as a politician, you want to ensure that you leave stronger and bigger and better than the relationship that you inherited. And I very much hope I can play a small role in doing that.
Well said. Please join me in thanking UK Secretary Gavin Williamson.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you please...